I'm Rachel Bade, Politico's Capitol Bureau Chief, and I'm super jazzed about this next conversation because the senator I'm sitting next to is one of the first principals we've had up here who really comes at U.S. foreign policy from this new MAGA perspective. Senator Eric Schmitt, he's a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, but more importantly, he's part of this sort of rebellion against traditional GOP foreign policy thinking. And obviously with President Trump changing a lot on the international stage right now, it's great to have you here to sort of help explain everything.
Sure.
So I have a lot of questions for you, and he's got to actually go back to vote pretty soon. So let's just jump in here. You have said that the U.S. needs to end its, quote, adventurism of the past couple of decades. You've said we need to see a crackdown on what you perceive as wasteful Pentagon spending. You've said that NATO countries must do more to protect themselves, and that the military needs to pivot from focusing on things like places like Europe to confronting communist China. So obviously some of this is a break from traditional GOP thinking. And just start there. What has the establishment been getting wrong about foreign policy, and how should they be fixing it?
I think there's a hubris, honestly, that exists of not being able to really adjust. And so my view, and you can call it a bunch of things, whether it's being a prioritizer, a Jacksonian, I think American realism is probably a better term, and it's sort of the ascending view, I think, of the Republican Party. You see that with President Trump, you see that with Vice President Vance. And really the premise is that you operate from a sense of scarcity. America cannot be everywhere all at once all the time. And what are our core national interests? Our core national interests are the United States of America and the rising and existing threat of communist China. It doesn't mean we don't have other relationships. It just means that in a atrophied industrial base, we've got to be really pretty focused. And so this is really about kind of getting back to the basics. In many ways, this was America's foreign policy for a very long time. After World War II ended, and you could kind of relate this to our trade policy to some degree too, we wanted our friends and allies after, Europe and Japan was devastated after the war. We wanted them to get back on their feet. NATO was created to protect Europe from Soviet communism. But then after the Cold War, there was never really an adjustment. There was never really an adjustment about our role, and to the extent that the idea was that we were going to be the world's policeman, I think that that's been a real policy failure. So this is getting back to the basics.
So does that look like, the U.S. pulling troops out of Europe? Does it mean pulling troops out of South Korea? What does that actually look like
practically? It means that in many ways, and I went to Munich, we were talking about this backstage, I went to Munich to sort of tell our European friends, not just what they want to hear, but the truth, that this isn't some blip. This is the ascending view is my take. And I think that, to your point on Europe, it doesn't mean we're withdrawing from NATO, but it's a greater expectation from our NATO allies. For example, if NATO met the defense spending numbers that we have, that would be $300 billion a year freed up for us to focus on the Indo-Pacific. If you took half that number, let's just call it $150 billion a year, it would mean that we could fund all the unfunded priorities from the Defense Department 15 times over every year. So the fact is, we've provided this umbrella. Europe has not stepped up in a meaningful way. They are making overtures, but my point to them was getting a percentage of your GDP on defense spending up to a number. It's not just the number, it's how you're deploying those dollars. If it's for pensions, that doesn't really help. If it's for other things, essentially, GDP numbers don't win wars, munitions do. The problem Europe has, in a much more advanced degree than we have, is the deindustrialization that's happened, even in Germany recently, really limits their ability to produce the things that they need to protect themselves. And so this is a long-term challenge.
So if they don't step up and pay more, should the U.S. withdraw from NATO?
I think everything should be on the table. I don't think that's really where we're at. I think that NATO is an important alliance, but I think the United States of America, from my view, is tired of sort of getting ripped off. And you're seeing this play out in the trade deals. Again, trade policy, foreign policy never really adjusted after the Cold War. So I do think that President Trump in his first term got the attention of the European leaders. They started to step that up. It didn't really happen much after Joe Biden because it's very different rhetoric. But now I think they're actually meeting this week to step up that number. On average, they're about 2.1%, I think, of Canada and our European allies on defense spending. But again, every dollar is not the same. Like if that just means you're funding your pensions, you're not building tanks, you're not building long-range or short-range fires.
So President Trump top ally of yours, obviously, has talked about the U.S. helping or turning Gaza into this sort of Riviera Maya, although we haven't heard that recently, right? That was a few weeks ago. He has come up with this idea of a minerals deal with Ukraine, which in theory would mean some Americans would be there as well. There was the month-long bombing of the Houthis, talk about Greenland and Canada as a 51st state. I mean, you are, like I mentioned at the top, you know, very much the MAGA foreign policy view. Is this America first, though?
Absolutely. I think that you can't talk about, just talked about the Monroe Doctrine. If you have the communist China controlling both ends of the Panama Canal, that doesn't do anything for our safety and security if we're actually in a scrape. By the way, 70% of our commerce flows through there. And if we need, and we currently do move naval ships through the Panama Canal, the idea that China controls both ports on either end is insane. The strategic importance of Greenland cannot be understated. It's not talking about invading Greenland, but the fact that Russia and China has their eyes on not only critical minerals in Greenland, but also in the Arctic, with opening up sea lanes and also just the strategic missile defense capabilities that are available there. We have a base there. I think we need to grow that. So I think those are important. But also what you're seeing in the Middle East, again, people get distracted by, in my view, this is sort of in Washington, like the shiny object of the day. But I would encourage everybody to actually listen to President Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia. It was maybe the most definitive America First sort of real American realism speech I've heard from an American president. Essentially what he said is, the days of us looking into the souls of foreign leaders and deciding if you're a good person or a bad person and then trying to bomb the hell out of that country and then nation build, those days are over. And what you're seeing now is a reset in the Middle East. Iran is more isolated now than it ever has been. And that is a recipe for peace. And so I think it's important that President Trump is over there. But clearly, shifting our focus away from Europe, not withdrawing from NATO, but shifting our focus away into the Indo-Pacific, having our European allies step up in a much more meaningful way allows us to go do that. That, I think, is the America First foreign policy.
So you mentioned Iran. Where do you come down on this sort of question about where the red line should be when it comes to negotiating with Iran? I mean, there's this question, obviously, about whether Americans should allow Tehran to sort of continue some uranium enrichment internally, or do they need to sort of import it all, totally take that out as part of a deal? Where do you come down on that? Because a lot of people believe that Iran is never going to say we're not going to do any uranium enrichment, and it's specifically for, you know, civilian purposes. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think my position, which is I think consistent with the administration's position, is that Iran can never have a nuclear capability, a nuclear war.
Well, everybody, I think a lot of people would agree with that, but
yeah,
the specifics of...
But the problem, though, is, well, I think American inspectors would be a very important aspect of the deal. I don't want to get too far out in front of those negotiations if they are going to, in fact, happen. But I think a real understanding that they just do not have the capability. I think, sadly, the last 4 years under Joe Biden, sanctions weren't enforced. You know, they wanted to cut a deal with no verification. Iran was enriched. The Houthis as a proxy, Hezbollah as a proxy. I mean, they were, I mean, October 7th is a direct result of that kind of failure. So I think President Trump has the Iranians on their back foot right now. I think he's looking to expand the map on the Abraham Accords, which I think actually further helps that negotiation as well. And I think you could get to a place where a nuclear weapon is completely off the table.
Do you think, I mean, as somebody who does not want to see the U.S. engaged in any sort of new war, especially in the Middle East with Iran, do you worry, though, that if the administration does draw a line at saying no internal enrichment of uranium, is that just sort of like a check the box, and like, are we headed to a war with Iran? Like, I guess I'm curious, like, is that a fear of yours?
Obviously,
that there's a risk of going there.
I think that one of the things that President Trump, I think, ran on, that he's delivering on, is being more respected across the world, because people believe that he means what he says. And that, I don't think that can be can be understated as it relates to foreign policy. I think the fact that he's there in the first 100 days and shoring up alliances is a very, very important thing. And by the way, investment here in the United States that only strengthens those ties. You saw that with Saudi Arabia. I just think Iran is an incredibly weak state right now. and the conditions for getting a deal that can be verified on our terms are better than they ever have been before.
Let's do a little news of the week. A lot of Republicans, from Laura Loomer to Rand Paul and John Thune, have been sort of balking at this news that President Trump wants to accept a $400 million jet from Qatar as his new Air Force One. Curious your take, as obviously a person who is close with the president, a big fan of the president. Do you think that's a bad idea?
I just don't, it's a free plane. I really don't, I don't get too far out in front of this thing. Do I believe that this, I just think that we move from the Democrats' argument for 4 years was that this guy is a threat to democracy and it's an existential threat to democracy. I think the American people sat in the jury box, they weighed all that evidence, they weighed the lawfare, and they rejected it. And so now every day is a new quote unquote constitutional crisis, or you got the plane. I just think most people, I'm from Missouri, the show me state, this is just not what people are really talking about. But I get it, you asked the question.
Well,
news of the
it
week.
does say in the Constitution the president can't accept gifts from foreign government.
Yeah.
So.
Well, there's a lot more attention on this than Joe Biden potentially being compromised by the Chinese or the Ukrainians, or his son having a laptop that certainly probably had some evidence of that. But here we are. I guess my answer is I don't think it's a big deal.
And that's interesting too, not just, I mean, ethical questions aside, you come from a state where Boeing manufactures a lot of their military equipment, right? And we've heard the president sort of blame Boeing for this, saying they're taking way too long
on Air Force One.
On Air Force One.
Yeah.
Is he right? Is Boeing dropping it on the floor and not picking it up fast
Well,
enough?
they've had challenges on the commercial side. There's no doubt about that. I think the delays on Air Force One have been frustrating. There's no doubt about that. But I think Boeing, from my perspective, Boeing was just awarded, and I leaned in pretty hard on this, awarded the F-47, the next generation, the NGAD fighter that can see further, go faster, have a bigger payload, and by the way, will be built for the Indo-Pacific in many ways, right, as we pivot towards that being our real challenge long term, as the 21st century is going to be defined, in my view, by who wins this great powers competition between the United States and China. So Boeing has a big presence in St. Louis. We're happy there's going to be 5,000 new jobs associated with this. They build, in my view, some of the best military aircraft in the world, and that's only going to be strengthened.
You talk a lot about the Indo-Pacific. What is it about China that has you most concerned?
I think they, from a historical context, they believe they're the Middle Kingdom. I think they view the last 150 years as a great humiliation, and they're not going to let that happen again. We've seen a 500% increase in their military spending in the last 10 years. That's what we know of. Everything is dual use. They're for real in space. They're building islands in the South China Sea. They have hypersonics. I mean, they have visions of world domination. They think America is a failed experiment on the decline, and they're the ascending power. And we have to take it that seriously. We have never had, and I can't overstate this, we've never had a peer like this that's an economic rival and a military rival. The Soviet Union was a military rival and of course a nuclear rival, but never an economic rival. China is. And so I think even as we get into trade discussions, you've got two buckets. You've got China and you've got everybody else. And I think as it relates to our national security, you've got China and you've got everybody else.
So a lot of critics of this sort of America first take on foreign policy, they think it's going to go away. You said at the top, it's not going away. What makes you so sure?
Well, that's where the American people are at. Yeah. I would point that out. But I think that you have to accept the idea that with our current industrial base, and by the way, I support building that up. That is, I think, one thing that unifies more of the sort of, I would say, the American realist point of view and then the more neocon point of view. We do believe that we have to have peace through strength, and a military buildup is necessary, and not just more money, but procurement reform, more innovation, being more nimble at the Pentagon. I think that's something that certainly unites everybody. But I think that we can't be everywhere all at once all the time. We just don't have that ability. So if you're constructing tanks for a land war in Europe, you are necessarily not building enough long-range fires for the Indo-Pacific. And that's just a reality. And so the sooner we accept that reality and try to build out and be prepared for what our real threats are. And people will, take the Golden Dome, for example, which is something that's probably going to happen as well. That's all about protecting the homeland first. Then you focus on the Indo-Pacific, and then you try to calm any tensions that exist in an area like the Middle East. And President Trump's doing all that. The Russia-Ukraine war is going to end. It's going to end sometime this year. It'll be a negotiated peace. The American people don't have a stomach for another $60 billion to Ukraine. I'm just telling you, that's just the truth.
So what happens, though, if Putin continues to drag his feet in terms of...
Well, no, he needs to be sincere. I think that the president's made clear that, that he is in this to negotiate a lasting peace. And as long as both sides are interested in that, that's exactly, I think, the outcome. And so, I mean, I can't predict the future, but...
But of course, Putin did not show today in Istanbul a lot of talk that he really doesn't want peace. He just wants to continue fighting. Is it time for sanctions? Should President Trump slap down new sanctions to force him to the table?
Yeah, I think in the middle of a negotiation right now, that would be premature. I think that's
I
think it's on the table, absolutely. Yeah. If they don't reach some agreement, I think all of that should be on the table. But I do think that to the extent... And I don't think, I think that, look, this is a meat grinder. Thousands of people are dying every week on both sides. This needs to come to an end. Russia is not what they once were, but long protracted wars of attrition. They've done that before. They have more natural resources and they have more men. And so it really is time, I think, for both sides to come to the table. And I say that for somebody that, thinks Ukraine has much to gain from that as well. And so I think the minerals deal is a big part of that. That certainly, I think, only makes it more important for us to drive the two parties together to end up with something that can work long term.
We got to talk a little palace intrigue, because that's the thing I focus on a lot in my reporting. You are a close ally of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. I think you were one of the first senators to meet with him,
Sure.
if I'm not mistaken, advocated for him behind the scenes. Now, the controversy over there has died down a little bit, but in recent weeks we have seen a lot of negative headlines surrounding, what's going on at the Pentagon regarding these, firings, with the secretary saying these people leaked, so I got rid of them. But I do know from my own reporting that there was, for a time at the Pentagon, essentially a cockfight happening amongst top Hegseth advisors, fighting over influence of the secretary, trying to get to be his wingman. Does it concern you that, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the most important department, I guess, in our country when it comes to our national security, was sort of seeming to be embroiled in a little bit of a high school drama?
I don't know how much of that's overplayed, what's real. I do think, though, that as you look at some of the real challenges that the Pentagon has, and as President Trump picked reformers for all these key kind of cabinet positions, a lot of it is cultural. A lot of things that need to happen. I mean, we do the NDA every year, and we direct things, and there is a bipartisan, I think, consensus that China is our biggest threat. We need procurement reform. That is something that's not particularly controversial, but some of that's cultural, right? Some of that has to be driven from the top. I think Secretary Hegseth is doing that. I think Bridge Colby was a great pick for Deputy Undersecretary, or I should say Undersecretary for Policy. So he's a very important player there as you kind of move into, again, this sort of American realist point of view of what our foreign policy should look like from a military perspective at the Pentagon. I think Marco Rubio is delivering that from the State Department. But to answer your question, it doesn't concern me. I think you're going to have turnover when you have a new administration. Military recruitment is up. I think they are moving towards models that do encourage more innovation. You've got more players. I'm sure many of them in the breakout sessions are being heard. You've got more players. Even though Boeing has a very strong presence in St. Louis, I think it's a very good thing to have a bunch more players, smaller players in that ecosystem for innovation. I mean, you think of the procurement system, for an F-47 is very different than what it should be for drones that, 6 months from now will be completely outdated. So
I love how he pivots from the controversial question right back to the selling the local issue with Boeing and F-47s. Last question for you. Is there anything you would change about what President Trump is doing on the world stage right now?
No, no, I don't think so. I think that America's stronger than it's been in a very long time. I think there's a lot of momentum. And this is a free country, so people are going to, and I'm a big supporter of the First Amendment. I certainly, as Attorney General, had the big Missouri versus Biden censorship case. People can have, that's what's great about this country. People can have different points of view. But I think objectively speaking, the $10 trillion worth of investment we're seeing come into this country. I think you're going to see trade barriers lowered across the globe. We have a secure border right now. We have a foreign policy that's aligned with the American people. I think we're going to be safer and more prosperous. So I think it's been an incredible 120 days.
Senator Schmitt, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yep, thanks.
He's got to go vote.